My name is Michael. I'm a student at a pedagogical university, not originally from the area. I didn't want to live in the dorms, but for a while I had no choice. During that time, I saved up money from my scholarship and part-time jobs, and eventually, I managed to rent a small 2-bedroom apartment in an old post-war building. The apartment was owned by a woman in her 40s. I'm not a fan of agencies, contracts, and all the hassle, so this arrangement suited me just fine. She seemed a bit downcast, almost nervous, but I didn't ask any questions. After all, she was a stranger, and her problems were none of my business. She showed me the apartment for about 15 minutes, explaining the basics, how the utilities worked, where to find the meters, and so on. Then, she said something that made me uneasy. "Michael," she began, "when you go to bed, always make sure to close the curtains." She said it in a way that suggested something terrible might happen if I didn't. I asked her why. "There are streetlights outside," she said. "They recently installed new bulbs, and they're as bright as the sun. The light shines straight into the windows, and it's hard to sleep." "Thanks for the warning," I replied, but it felt like there was more she wasn't telling me. After she left, I locked the door and started unpacking. The apartment had clearly been empty for a while. The neighbors were mostly elderly retirees who rarely went outside, though occasionally, some of them gathered on the benches near the entrance. Once I finished tidying up, I decided to go grocery shopping. A small store was nearby, so it didn't take long. By the time I returned, the sun was setting, and an inexplicable unease crept over me. As I entered the courtyard, I noticed something strange. Everyone had their curtains drawn, every single window. I walked around the building to see if it was the same on the other side. It was. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Sure, closing curtains at night was normal, but this felt different. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. That night, I cooked dinner, watched some YouTube videos, and went to bed around 2 in the morning. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard dogs barking outside. The sound grew louder, more aggressive, and then shifted to a strange, pitiful whining. Curious, I got up and peeked through the curtain. The dogs were running around the yard, their behavior frantic and disjointed, brushing it off as some random animal disturbance. I drank some water and went back to bed. The next morning, as I woke up, something caught my eye, a handprint on the frosty outside of my window. I lived on the 3rd floor, so it made no sense. For a moment, I sat frozen, my unease from the previous day returning in full force. Later, I rushed to class, determined to forget about the handprint, the dogs, and the curtains. After a busy day and a couple of beers with a friend, I headed home. As I walked into the courtyard, I noticed once again that every window had its curtains tightly closed, except mine. This time, I couldn't ignore the growing dread. Inside, I encountered an old man on the 1st floor. His eyes were wide with panic as he grabbed my arm and muttered something incoherent about closing the curtains and running away. Shaking him off, I hurried upstairs, trying to push his words out of my mind. That night, the barking returned, louder and more frantic than before. When I looked out the window, I saw a figure standing in the courtyard. It looked human but wasn't quite right. Its head was oddly shaped, and its arms were unnaturally long. Couldn't look away. It seemed to sense me watching and began moving toward the building. Its gait was bizarre, almost like a dance, and it wore a twisted grin that made my skin crawl. As it reached the entrance, I lost sight of it, but then I saw a hand, its hand on my window. Slowly, its face came into view. Pale skin, black eyes, and that horrifying grin. It knocked softly at first, then harder and harder until the glass shattered. I ran, hearing the sound of footsteps behind me. On the street, I glanced back and saw it crawling down the side of the building like a grotesque spider. I ran until I couldn't breathe, eventually stumbling onto another street. As I paused to catch my breath, I saw it again, still following, still moving with that unnerving dance-like gait. It wasn't human. I screamed at it, demanding to know what it wanted, but it just stared with its empty black eyes. Then, it started running toward me. By sheer luck, I found a police car nearby and jumped inside. The officers didn't believe me, thinking I was drunk or on drugs. They drove me to the station to check, but of course they found nothing. The next morning, I returned to the apartment to grab my things and left for good. A week later, while staying with a friend, I saw it again. A handprint on the frosty window outside and its silhouette dancing in the light of a street lamp.